Life is full of unexpected surprises. I thought that at 55, I had passed the years of excitement, that intense emotions were just a distant memory. But then on a rainy night in Los Angeles I met Ethan. A young man who made me feel the vitality of my heart again. If you haven't seen part 1, go back to understand more about that fateful encounter. And now I will continue this story, where secrets begin to unfold. It had been a month since that night. The night I walked out of Ethan's apartment with a pensive heart. I had convinced myself that Ethan was just a passing breeze in my life, a fleeting moment I would keep as a private secret, unknown to anyone. I believed that after that night, he would forget me, just as I had tried to forget him. A random encounter that neither of us needed to mention again. But I was wrong. Tonight was the reunion of my old college friends. We had met when we were young, when the world was still a big place filled with endless opportunities. But now, as we gathered again, it was no longer to talk about the future but to reflect on the past, to reminisce about the days gone by and the people we once were. The reunion was held in a luxurious hotel in the city center. My old friends now had families, children, even grandchildren. We had all been through ups and downs in life, but as we sat together, I could still see the same bright eyes from our youth. There was one person I could not ignore, Michael. Michael was my ex-boyfriend, my first love from college. He was a black man with a gentle smile and warm eyes. We had been deeply in love, but our relationship could not withstand the barriers imposed by our families. I was born into a wealthy family, while Michael came from a humble background. My parents never accepted him, and after countless battles I was forced to let him go. I hadn't seen him in years. Tonight, as I entered the hotel, I knew I would see Michael again. But I never expected that he would not be the only surprise waiting for me. Because the moment I stepped into the lobby, I saw Ethan. He was standing right behind Michael. My heart stopped for a second. Ethan was still the same, tall, confident, devastatingly handsome. But what shocked me the most was not just seeing him again. It was the way he stood there as if he belonged. Our eyes met. There was something unreadable in Ethan's gaze. Not the look of a stranger, nor the look of an ex-lover. Everything suddenly became confusing. I didn't understand why he was here. Why, of all places, was Ethan at my college reunion? And most importantly, why was he standing behind Michael? A strange unease crept into my heart. Was this just a coincidence? Or was fate playing a cruel joke on me? I stood frozen, staring at Ethan in shock. It felt as if the world around me had slowed, leaving only him. Standing behind Michael, the man I had loved so deeply but had been forced to give up. Ethan didn't avoid my gaze. He held it steadily, his expression unreadable. He didn't seem surprised to see me. Instead, there was something else in his eyes, as if he had known I would be here. My breathing grew shallow. None of my old friends noticed the turmoil on my face. And then, an unexpected moment changed everything. Michael turned to Ethan, placed a proud hand on his shoulder, and said, let me introduce you. This is Ethan, my son." I felt my entire body stiffen. The words rang in my head, but I couldn't immediately process them. Son? Ethan was Michael's son? No. No way. I turned to Ethan, searching his face for confirmation. And that's when I saw it. A flicker of amusement in his eyes, as if he had been waiting to see my reaction. Michael, oblivious to my shock, continued proudly, "Ethan is the CEO of a big company. He's done even better than I ever imagined." I don't know how I reacted. Maybe I nodded. Maybe I forced a smile. Maybe I said something meaningless to cover up my confusion. But inside, everything was spiraling out of control. How could this be happening? How could I have spent a night with the son of the man I once loved? Everything suddenly became too much to bear. I needed air. "Excuse me, I need to use the restroom," I murmured, barely able to form the words. Then I turned and walked away without looking back. But I heard footsteps following me. I stopped in an empty hallway. And then behind me a deep, familiar voice spoke. "You didn't expect to see me like this, did you, Ethan?" I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing. But I knew, from this moment on, nothing would ever be the same again. He approached. Slow, deliberate steps. Until he was standing right in front of me. His eyes burned with emotion. A mixture of reproach and heartbreak. "Why did you leave without saying a word?" I said nothing. because I didn't know how to answer. His voice softened, but it held an edge of sadness. I looked everywhere for you, you know? Ethan continued. When I woke up and you weren't there, I thought maybe you had just stepped out for a moment. But as I waited and waited, I realized you were really gone. I lowered my gaze, unable to meet his eyes. I went to the cafe where we first met. I walked down the streets where I thought you might appear. But you were gone, as if you never existed. He took a deep breath. And then in a quiet, broken voice, he added, I don't understand. Do you even know what it feels like? For the first time in my life, I met a woman who made me feel something real. And then she disappeared without a trace. Ethan's voice was filled with pain. And in that moment, I felt the weight of my choices crash down upon me. I could feel the sincerity in his words. Finally, when there was nowhere else to look, Ethan returned to his father's house. He had never thought of confiding in his father about his love life. But that night, sitting on the porch bench, he told his father everything. He told him that he had found a woman he loved, but she had left without saying goodbye. He didn't know how to find her again, nor did he know if she even wanted to see him again. Michael was silent for a moment before patting his son on the shoulder and saying, Son, if you really believe she's important, you can't just sit here and let her go. Ethan thought it was just a simple piece of advice. But then something unexpected happened. Michael slowly stood up and walked to the old wooden cabinet in the living room, the place where he kept the memories of his youth. He opened the drawer and took out a box filled with old photographs. Dad once had someone he couldn't forget, Michael murmured. He pulled out a photo and placed it in Ethan's hand. It was a college graduation photo. A group of young students standing together, smiling brightly. And in the center of the photo, Michael stood next to a girl. She had long flowing hair and a determined gaze. Ethan looked down at the photo. A shock ran through his body. The girl in the picture, she looked so much like Olivia. Every feature of her face. Those eyes. That smile. Even after all these years, it was unmistakable. Ethan felt his heart pounding. A strange feeling welled up inside him. A truth slowly forming in his mind. He turned to his father, his voice hoarse with disbelief. Dad, what's her name? Michael looked at his son, a flash of nostalgia in his eyes. Olivia. Ethan felt his world tilt. That name. The name he had been whispering in his mind for the past month. The name he had called out in his dreams. And now it was coming from his father's lips. Olivia. The woman he had spent months searching for. The woman who had kept him up at night. Was his father's first love. A long silence stretched between father and son. Ethan couldn't believe what he had just heard. He looked at the photo again, trying to match the face from the past with the face of the woman he had loved. And then he understood one thing. This couldn't be a coincidence. Olivia was the woman he had let slip away. And this time he wouldn't let it happen again. I sat there in silence, listening to Ethan's every word. The emotion in his voice. There was something strange about hearing this story from his own lips, knowing that he had searched for me, that he had been tormented by my disappearance, and that he had finally discovered a truth no one could have expected. The hotel room was so quiet I could hear my heart beating. I didn't know how to react. Everything had happened so suddenly, so quickly, so beyond my control. I had thought that my encounter with Ethan was just a fleeting infatuation, that we would both forget each other, as a beautiful but short-lived memory. But I was wrong. Ethan didn't look at me like a woman who had lived many years. He didn't see me as someone 25 years older than him. He looked at me like a man in love, with seriousness, with determination, with a sincerity that I didn't dare believe was real. I never thought that anyone could love me this way, especially not someone as young as Ethan. He sat across from me, his eyes shining under the soft yellow light of the room. Part of me wanted to turn away, to avoid his gaze. But another part of me couldn't look away. I don't care. His voice rang out deep and sure. I blinked confused. I don't care who you were, Ethan continued. I don't care whom you loved in the past. Each word sank into my mind. I only care about now. And now I want you. I took a deep breath, feeling the air in the room suddenly become too heavy. Such simple words. Yet they carried a weight I couldn't ignore. Ethan looked at me as if I were someone precious. someone to be protected, to be cherished. Even though I was so much older than him, I had never had anyone look at me that way before. I used to think I was too old to love anyone again. I used to think that strong emotions like this were only for the young, that my heart was no longer strong enough to feel this way. But Ethan made me doubt all of that. He was unlike any man I had ever met. He was determined, and he really truly wanted me. I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could say anything, Ethan leaned forward. His eyes were intense, unwavering. I asked my father if there was any chance of seeing you again, he said, his voice low. And when he told me about this reunion, I knew I couldn't miss this opportunity. My eyes widened. I realized what he was saying. You left your job just to come here? Ethan nodded, without hesitation. And I won't let you disappear again. I felt something inside me crumble. A wall I had built over the years to protect myself. A wall I had convinced myself would never fall. And yet here it was, crumbling. That I was fine. That I didn't need anyone. That age had taken away my right to love and desire. But Ethan was breaking down all those thoughts, bit by bit, with his sincerity. I wanted to believe him. But could I? I didn't know how long I sat there in silence, lost in my thoughts. Ethan waited patiently. He didn't rush. He didn't push. He just sat there, as if he was willing to wait for me as long as it took. Finally I spoke. But my voice was small, almost fragile, as if I was afraid to face my own feelings. I don't know. Ethan looked at me for a long moment. Then he smiled. A gentle smile, but also one filled with determination. You don't need to know right now, he said softly. But I won't let you disappear again. I looked up at him, and in that moment I knew he was serious. Ethan wasn't just saying it. He meant it. And for the first time in years, I felt my heart beating faster for someone. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if I had the courage to open up. But I knew one thing for sure. Ethan wouldn't give up on me that easily. And maybe I didn't want to run away anymore. Before I could even process what Ethan had just said, before I could fully comprehend the turmoil of emotions in my heart, a deep, authoritative voice spoke from behind me. Ethan. We both turned, startled. Michael. He was standing just a few feet away. His eyes wide, as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard. His gaze swept over me, then stopped at Ethan. A mixture of shock, confusion, and rising anger. Neither Ethan nor I knew how long Michael had been standing there. How much had he heard? Probably everything. The air suddenly became stifling. Michael stepped closer, his eyes piercing through his son. What the hell are you doing? His voice was low, but every word was filled with anger. Ethan straightened, not avoiding his father's gaze. You heard me, Ethan said, his voice firm. I love her. Michael laughed faintly, but there was no mirth in it. Love. He emphasized the word as if it was the most ridiculous thing he had ever heard. Are you telling me you love? I felt a chill run down my spine when I heard Michael say my name. It had been years since that name had come out of his mouth. And now, as it came back, it carried a terrifying weight. Dad, I know this may surprise you, but... Michael cut him off. No, Ethan. You don't know anything. His voice was firm. You don't understand anything. Ethan frowned. Dad, I'm an adult. This is my decision. Michael glared at his son, as if he had just said something completely ridiculous. You think just wanting it is enough? His voice was sharp. You have no idea what the consequences of this will be. My throat felt dry, but I kept quiet. I wanted to know why. I wanted to know why Michael had reacted so strongly. Ethan clenched his fists. What consequences? His voice was strained. Why would you object? Michael took a deep breath, trying to suppress the emotions rising inside him. How can I be with someone who was in your past? His words pierced my heart. How can I love someone you loved? Ethan stiffened, but he didn't back down. The past is the past, Dad. His voice was calm, unwavering. Whatever you had with her ended a long time ago. Michael laughed again, but this time there was bitterness in it. Do you think that doesn't matter? He turned to me. His eyes, no longer those of a man reminiscing about his first love, but of a father who had just seen his son step onto a path he couldn't accept. Olivia, you left once. Do you know how long it took me to forget you? His voice was cold. And now you come back, not to me but to my son? I wanted to answer, to explain. But my lips were too dry to utter a word. Michael turned to Ethan, his anger rising. Do you understand what you're doing? His voice grew sharper. Do you understand that one day you'll realize you were wrong? Ethan stood firm, unwavering. Dad, this is my life. Michael shook his head, as if he couldn't believe what his son had just said. No, Ethan. This time his voice held authority. If you keep this up, you'll ruin everything. I looked at Michael, feeling my heart tighten. He didn't object because I was older than Ethan. He objected because I was a part of his past. And maybe deep down he still hadn't completely forgotten me. Ethan looked at his father, his eyes filled with disappointment. You can't stop me. Michael curled his lips, his eyes colder than ever. If you really think so, then you have nothing more to say to me. Then he turned, grabbed Ethan's arm, and pulled him away. Let's go. Ethan pulled his hand away, but Michael walked away first, as if he wanted to end this conversation immediately. Before he left, he turned to look at me one last time, his eyes full of regret. I wanted to call out to him, to stop him, but I couldn't. The silhouettes of father and son gradually disappeared down the long corridor, and I stood there alone in the cold hallway, and I knew this was not the end. If you want to continue this story, comment too. Perhaps fate still has many surprises waiting ahead.